Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Chile. It's the birthplace of neoliberalism, but will it also be the death of it? We're looking at how this doctrine has ended up undermining democracy over the past 4 decades. And our case study is the South American country hit by protests for nearly a month now. Also this week, money makes the world go round, but is there such a thing as the wrong kind of investment? There's a corporate tax dodge taking hold out there, and it's depriving the developing world of much needed money. And we'll take you to Thailand, one of the world's largest sugar producers and exporters, but much of this sweet stuff shouldn't be here right now, and that's not good news for the farmers. It all began, as these things do, with one very specific grievance. In this case, Chilean students protesting about a hike in train fares. Now it's mushroomed into weeks of protests about an economy that's on the slide after years of doing comparatively well against its neighbours. But Chile's story goes back further than that. Under the dictatorship of right-wing military dictator Augusto Pinochet, it was a testbed for unfettered free market economics, or what we would call neoliberalism. The experiment in the 1970s was continued by democratic governments from 1990 to the present day. And while under Pinochet it was a failure, post-dictatorship, the economy has performed better than its neighbours. So let's do what we always try to do here in Counting the Cost and tell the story through numbers. And you're going to see some data here in the video wall from 5 different Latin American economies, including Chile, of course. Starting with how rich people are in terms of GDP or GDP per capita. Now, 1990 is where we start. Chile is the orange line, and it's a middling nation at the end of Pinochet's regime. Venezuela, with the purple line, clearly the richest Latin American economy. But as time rolls on, look at Chile. It moves well up the graph there, while Venezuela pretty much drops off the charts there. Let's use a different metric now. We call this the Gini index, which measures economic inequality. And this one we're picking up from 1987. Again, watch the orange line for Chile. Like its neighbours, it is what we would call an unequal economy. It's got a Gini reading of 56. And just so you know, the closer you are to 100 on this index, the worse you are. But by 2014, well, we've dropped down a little bit. It's at about 50 there, just below 50. So regionally, still in a good position, though we should point out, as a member of the Industrialised Nations Club, the OECD, Chile is actually the lowest ranked nation. And finally, we will use unemployment, which is a little bit chaotic here at the start of our graph in the early 90s. Just over 5% it is for Chile. But as we head back, look at, first of all, the blue line, Argentina, up to 19%. Venezuela's in bad shape as well. By 2017, we're looking at actually an increase in unemployment in Chile, up to 7%, but it's still below the levels of Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina. So what you're seeing there was a country that was doing well, but seems to have lost its way. In a moment, we will make sense of all of this with our guest from the Economist magazine. But first, our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, in Santiago, with more on the protests, the cause and the effect.
Chile is accustomed to frequent and strong earthquakes. But an unprecedented social outburst that exploded 3 weeks ago is sending much deeper shockwaves throughout what was seen as Latin America's most stable and prosperous democracy. It was sparked off by a relatively small increase in the metro fare. But millions of Chileans saw it as the last straw and took to the streets to show that they've had enough of an economic system that they say hasn't delivered its promise of prosperity. Except for an increasingly wealthy few. 57-year-old Rosa Ortega has worked as a maid all her life. Her eldest son and husband work in construction and became unemployed this week. Like millions of middle and lower middle-class Chileans, they're deep in debt and struggling just to feed themselves.
But the most worst is yet to come. Yesterday, I was on the bus with a 75-year-old pensioner who still works as a maid because her pension is $136, which is more than I'll get. No one can survive on that. We'll all have to work till we drop dead.
Overhauling Chile's private pension system, which was installed during the former military dictatorship, is one of the most pressing demands, along with decent wages, public health care, education, and affordable transportation. The list of grievances is long. Rosa's children have all taken part in the ongoing demonstrations.
Le costó 35 años despertar Chile.
I agree. It's taken Chile 35 years to wake up. All those promises about how the return of democracy would bring us happiness, all these years of injustice. It shouldn't have to come to this, but hopefully we'll get something out of it this time.
Chile isn't Latin America's poorest country. On the contrary, on the books it has the highest per capita income in the region and a stable economy based on an extreme free market model. And some see that as the problem.
The economic model established by the Constitution hands education, healthcare, social security and labour relations over to the private sector. The state plays a minimum role. The model has been very successful in generating wealth, but it has also generated enormous levels of inequality.
Chile is the member of the OECD with the highest income disparity. But conservative Senator Juan Antonio Coloma dismisses the notion that the economic model needs to be overhauled.
Let's put things into context. Chile has made incredible strides in the last 30 years. It's reduced poverty from 47.9% to 3%. It's a country that has changed dramatically, economically and socially.
But not fast enough for Chileans who say that they've been abused by a system that guarantees enormous profits for the private sector, while millions are struggling to stay afloat on increasingly meager salaries.
A person who makes $650 has to pay $300 just for rent. It's inconceivable.
Chile is a very expensive country. I mean, medicines and a number of things are as expensive as they are in Europe, but wages are a fraction.
Struggling with unrelenting social unrest and a steep drop in his popularity, President Sebastián Piñera says he's got the message. This week, he sent a bill to Congress to increase the minimum wage by 16.6%.
With this, I think we are responding with concrete actions, not just good interventions, to what our people are demanding so energetically.
But the leader of the country's largest trade union confederation says it's not nearly enough and is demanding basic wages be doubled to allow families to cover their basic needs.
If that is not addressed, we will have more disruption, more violence and more outbursts. And that's something that neither the government nor the opposition seems to understand.
The economic cost of 3 weeks of unrelenting nationwide protests is estimated at least $3 billion and rising. The vast majority of the protests are peaceful, but every day small but violent groups of vandals and hooded protesters destroy public and private property. Until now, the mass protests had been confined to the mid and downtown areas of Santiago, as well as working-class neighborhoods. But now they're relocating to the very heart of what's nicknamed Sanhattan, a spin-off of Manhattan because of its posh skyscrapers. That includes South America's tallest building. This is the gateway to Santiago's most affluent neighborhoods. And what these protesters are trying to do is demonstrate that their social uprising will also impact those who have the most to lose. The crisis has driven down this year's economic forecast, as well as Chile's currency. But what started as an economic and social crisis has rapidly spiraled into a political one, with calls for the president's resignation and a new constitution. Resolving this crisis within Chile's democratic institutions is turning out to be the biggest challenge. Lucia Newman for Counting the Cost.
With us now on Skype from Madrid is Michael Reid. Michael is the senior editor for Latin America and Spain at The Economist, also the author of the book Forgotten Continent, A History of the New Latin America. Nice to have you with us, Michael. I think what we're seeing around the world right now, not just in Chile, is this example of protest movements beginning from one thing, a spark almost. In this case, it was metro fares going up. Is it almost a case with Chile that that's what was needed, that discontent with the economy, discontent with the ruling class was there for a long time and it needed a spark?
I think that's right. I mean, clearly this is a worldwide phenomenon at the moment, and protesters have smartphones. They see what's happening elsewhere. But in the case of Chile, as you say, there's been a pervasive sense of discontent that has manifested itself from time to time in demonstrations and protests over the last dozen years or so. And on this occasion, it exploded into something much bigger. We had, very serious arson and damage to the metro system, firstly, and then very big peaceful protests about many issues facing Chile.
So where did it go wrong if we're looking more broadly at the economy, deeper into the economy? Where's it gone wrong? Because, as we've looked at in this program already, Chile has, by and large, been a success story in Latin America.
That's right. I mean, economic growth has been faster than average for the last 3 decades or so, and poverty has fallen a lot. It's a much less poor country than it was. I think at the center of this is the issue of rising expectations. I mean, Chileans have been told by their business elites and by part of the political elite that they should compare themselves, rather than with the rest of Latin America, they should compare themselves with the OECD, the club of mainly rich countries which Chile joined a few years ago. And if you do compare Chile with the OECD, then the society is much more unequal, much less fair, and there's much less generous public social provision.
Is this an example for us in 2019 that the idea of neoliberalism hasn't really worked, that trickle-down economics, for all its theory, doesn't play out properly or well for the people at the bottom?
Well, I'm tempted to reply, define neoliberalism.
Well,
it's a term which is used a lot as a kind of swear word. I mean, I would say two things. I mean, I think in general, there is a sense of unease in the world at the direction that capitalism has taken since the financial crisis. And that has a lot to do with technological change, the digital revolution, and the rise of China, and the concentration within business, within markets, and a sense that capitalism is less inclusive and less democratic than it was. The second thing is, I think, where Chile needs to look more carefully is that it did adopt a model under which market mechanisms were going to be the main source of social provision, of education, healthcare, pensions, and people would have to pay a lot of the cost of those themselves. I think that hasn't worked so well. It has been gradually and incrementally changed over the last 20 to 25 years. I think it needs more change with more public provision, and that means a tax system that does tax the better off more than they have been taxed in Chile so far.
So in other words, the people who are up protesting, they do have a fair grievance. They might not care what the definition of neoliberalism is, for example, but as long as they're not seeing benefits and as long as they're getting hit with taxes, they'll be thinking, what's in this for me?
I think this is right. I think that this is an important, but it's also a potentially dangerous moment in Chile, because if the government gets it right, then Chile can become a fairer society and can continue to be a successful economic model. If it gets it wrong, and this applies to the whole political class, let's say, in Chile, then there is a risk that it descends into populism, either of the left or right, and becomes more like Argentina. No?
Michael Reid joining us on Counting the Cost, talking Chile. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.
Now we're going to talk taxes, the one certainty in life, so they say, along with death. But when the lender of last resort asks some pretty tough questions about the way money is being channeled around the world, you know you need to sit up and take notice. This is the International Monetary Fund, which says so-called phantom investments made through corporate shell companies in tax havens are undermining tax collection from the most advanced to the poorest nations. Consider this. It says Luxembourg, a country of just 600,000 people, but which hosts as much FDI, foreign direct investment, as the United States, and much more than China. It's got $4 trillion in FDI, and that works out at about 6.6 million a person. But you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find that reflected in its actual economy. Now, all up, it's estimated 40 trillion in FDI is channeled around the world, but the phantom investments, they amount to an astonishing 15 trillion of that, or, to put it another way, the combined GDP of China and Germany. Why is all this important? Well, because that money is being shifted around to minimise tax, and it means that money isn't being used in developing countries to, for example, alleviate poverty. In fact, in 2015, the UN calculated developing countries lose at least $100 billion every year because multinationals shift their profits to countries where they pay little or no tax. For some context, $100 billion, that could provide safe drinking water and sanitary facilities for 2.2 billion people every year. More on this with our guest in a moment, but first Neve Barker takes a look at some of these tax havens and the cost to the world's nations.
Taxes have been described as the price we pay for civilization. We may not like them, but they're responsible for keeping our economies and our societies afloat, paying for roads, healthcare, education, defence, social security. The list goes on. All companies pay corporation tax on their annual profit. It's estimated $500 billion in taxes may be being deliberately avoided by some of the world's largest multinational corporations. That's roughly the same as the economic output of Sweden, or 20 times the UN's humanitarian aid budget. An index of worst offenders is dominated by a British-controlled network of jurisdictions. The British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands and the island of Jersey. Also in the top 10 is the Netherlands, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Singapore, the Bahamas and Hong Kong. According to the index, these 10 places are alone responsible for half of the world's corporate tax avoidance.
Big companies are free-riding on the global economy and in many cases causing enormous damage through their free-riding facilities. They're harming market quality. They might well also be harming the countries where they're operating by not enabling those countries to invest properly in educating their workers, training their workers, providing health services for their workers. So this is harmful activity.
Tax havens such as the Cayman Islands, a British overseas territory in the Caribbean, provide offshore banking services to wealthy foreign companies and individuals, allowing them to avoid paying tax in their countries of residence. And it's all largely legal. 100,000 companies are registered here, including British Petroleum and even Manchester United. For the past few years, the corporation tax rate here has been zero. But it's not for everyone. It requires wealth, money to invest and to pay for expensive advisors. The authors of the Corporate Tax Haven Index say this isn't a question of legality, but it is a question of fairness over a system where only the rich can afford to get even richer.
Joining us on Skype from Prague now is Peter Lansky. He's an associate professor of economics at Charles University in Prague. Nice to have you with us, Peter. I think maybe let's start with, for anyone who is not familiar with FDI, foreign direct investment, maybe just give us a broad view of why it's so important to the way money moves around the world.
So foreign direct investment, or FDI, is an investment that comes across borders within one company, usually a multinational corporation. So you can think of any multinational corporation and how it makes investments across borders, and that's FDI. This FDI is big and it's been increasing over time. It now accounts for, if you compare it, it's as large as half of the world's total GDP. FDI is increasing, and we know that it's large, but we also know that much of it is not driven by real investment, but by tax avoidance by these multinational corporations.
OK, so that is our issue here. And that is, I think, the issue that a lot of people have around the world, this idea of basically dodging taxes. We have to point out that companies are not actually doing anything illegal here. They are working within government frameworks. Is it really the governments who have allowed this to happen and who are to be blamed if there's to be blamed?
I'm probably not in a position to blame anybody, but I'm also careful to use the word tax avoidance by multinational corporations. So tax avoidance implies that it's not necessarily illegal. Tax evasion is the other term, which would imply that it's illegal. What is clear that this has harmful effects on other taxpayers and other countries. So some taxpayers, such as multinational corporations engaging in tax avoidance, are benefiting from it. Countries enabling this tax avoidance, such as tax havens, are also partly benefiting from it. But then there are the other taxpayers, other countries at all levels of incomes that are losing due to this tax avoidance in terms of tax revenue, but also in other ways.
Okay, so it's then not just the developing nations who are losing out. That's the very easy headline, I think. But advanced nations as well are actually losing their tax revenue as well.
Yes, that's right. In recent research published in International Tax and Public Finance with my colleague, we find that actually countries at all income levels are losing due to this tax avoidance of multinational corporations. The thing is that countries of various sizes and of various stage of development are in different position to tackle this tax avoidance by multinationals. It's probably easier for people to think of the United States having a lot of power to actually tackle this problem, whereas especially small, low-income countries have less powerful tools available to lower this tax avoidance. So this is where international cooperation comes to play, and this is supported by many scholars and by international organizations such as World Bank, OECD, or International Monetary Fund.
This is what I was going to ask you. Is there some sort of proposal from the likes of the IMF, some guidance, some guidelines which they've put out to say this is how we can actually deal with the issue?
So in the recent paper, they quantify how much of the FDI is real and how much it is not, how much it is driven by tax avoidance. So knowing how much is a first good step to reforming the system. And they indeed, the IMF economists say that they hope that this better data will improve the policies. But there are many specific proposals to fix the international tax corporate system one way or another. There are some proposals on unitary taxation by especially NGOs, which would see multinational corporations being treated as one company rather than a set of separate companies as it is now. But there are also other proposals by European Commission, for example, which has so far not been successful in implementing its so-called CCCTB proposal, Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, which would see basically a unitary taxation applied in the European Union alone.
Peter Lansky, we really do appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Finally this week, something bittersweet. Sugarcane farmers in parts of Asia are struggling to make ends meet because of an oversupply that sent prices to their lowest levels in 6 years. Some of the world's largest producers have huge stockpiles now, including Thailand. Wayne Hay has our report from there.
This factory in northeast Thailand isn't supposed to be operating at the moment. It's usually a time to prepare for the new harvest of sugarcane to arrive from farms around the province of Udon Thani. Instead, it's still processing and bagging last season's product, which for now isn't going any further than the storage sheds, which are becoming increasingly full.
Right now, it's that, because everything is slow. Just wait and see.
Last season, Thailand produced more sugar than ever, contributing to a global surplus and helping the price to plummet. It has a stockpile of around 7 million tonnes, over 1 million more than it had at the same time last year.
Another reason there is so much excess at the moment is because historically a lot of Thai and Indian sugar has been smuggled into China. But this year, Chinese authorities have cracked down on that illegal process to try to protect their own sugar industry.
Exports from Thailand are also being affected by the strength of the Thai baht, which has been Asia's best performing currency this year. It's farmers who are hurting the most. Costs are going up while their income falls.
Yes, I'm worried about the small farmers if the price keeps dropping. I'm afraid that people will give up. If we don't see any signs of improvement in a few years, it will be bad.
The oversupply and low prices are expected to remain for a few years, which may affect Thailand's long-term plans to increase sugar production by 70%. Some are concerned that if the expansion happens, it'll only benefit big businesses that can operate with smaller margins and further squeeze small farms.
Growing sugarcane costs a lot of money, and the deals between the farmers and sugar mills are not that fair. For example, the sugar mill won't take any responsibility if the farmer can't deliver the product. They don't care whether there's a drought or flood. The farmers take all the risk.
The government also wants to build 29 new sugar mills in the northeast, each with a biomass power plant attached. They use the material left over after the sugarcane is crushed as fuel. But with Thailand's sugar industry expected to lose more than $329 million this season, those plans may have to be reconsidered.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week, but we'd love to hear from you as well. You can tweet or message me directly at KamalAJE. The hashtag is AJCTC, or you can drop us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net. And there's more online too at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. Individual reports, links and entire episodes are there for you to watch whenever you want. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.